AM, and you're listening to Salam Media.
So it's not very often that you get military strikes within a country, because I mean that effectively suggests a civil war of sorts, right? It's often a country embarking in military hits on a neighboring country or somewhere further away. But that appears to be the case with regards to a military strike in Myanmar, and I understand 120 people have died. Let's get the story because it has relevance to an issue that we talk about often: the plight of the Rohingya Muslims in that region. My guest is Advocate Shabnam Mayat. She's the founder of Protect the Rohingya. Of course, she does extensive work on that space on the station, but of course elsewhere as well. So Shabnam, appreciate your time. Good morning and assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thank you. And I can't deny that I know your family pretty well, so salams to everybody at home too.
Wa alaikum salam.
Yeah, let's talk about, of course, the pressing issues. I'm looking at some pictures here, and as one would expect, right? If there's going to be an airstrike, there's going to be devastation, right? What's the story? What's happened?
So basically, in the Saigon region, on Tuesday there was an airstrike. Now, increasingly, we know that Myanmar has been fighting some of the longest civil wars in the world, almost 60 years. But what has happened since the coup in February of 2021 is that the military has become more vicious, and the same military that carried out the Rohingya genocide is now carrying out the worst atrocities against the civilian population who refuse to live under this coup government. Of course, they know after 60 years of living under a military junta that this is definitely not what they want. And on Tuesday, what happened was a local administration office was opening. There were around 300 people attending the celebration. Around 7:45 in the morning, fighter jets dropped bombs over the village of Pazigi. And after that, helicopter gunships stopped first responders by shooting and then also shot at survivors. This is, just a continuation of the violence that the military has unleashed on their civilian population since the starting of the coup. There's been around 1.4 million people displaced, 3,000 killed, more than 17,000 arrested, and around 13,000 still remain in detention.
Okay, well, as always, when you hear about these things anywhere in the world, I mean, it's always worrisome and troublesome. And that's why, for example, when you have problems like in Yemen, never mind what one may think ideologically, you don't want anyone to die. It's just horrific, right? However, I mean, I guess that as you're going to read more into the story, what's the backstory around these strikes? I mean, is it just a hit in isolation, or there's a more deeper motive around this?
So as the government, so there's been absolute rejection of this coup government. Aung San Suu Kyi and her government in February of 2021 were arrested. Now the National Unity Government, most of the members of which are in exile, and it also has its defense force known as the People's Defense Force, have been fighting guerrilla warfare against the military in the streets of Myanmar. And these, small armed groups along all the borders that have been fighting the Myanmar military for decades have now come forward and have united against this military government. So the past 2 years have been absolute devastation. A third of the population is in need of humanitarian aid. And just 6 days ago, another 10,000 people fled across the border into Thailand. Of course, there's been widespread condemnation with ASEAN, which is their regional bloc, even stepping in to say this is unacceptable. But the biggest issue, of course, is that there continues to be the supply chain of weapons and of jet fuel to the Myanmar military. And this is going to be the problem, because for as long as weapons are available, they will be able to use them on their civilian population. So the UN, the UK, Australia, Canada have all had sanctions against Myanmar since the coup. This includes Myanmar oil and gas, which is one of the biggest revenue spinners for the Myanmar government. But it's very, very important for countries to call for this jet fuel, ban for Myanmar, because more and more, as it's unstable on the ground, the military is taking to the air to attack the civilian population.
And I take it, as you've suggested, the coup and then these constant attacks, by and large, are carried out with impunity, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And what the Myanmar government says is that they're fighting terror, right? And this is exactly what we saw during the Rohingya genocide. And it basically just shows you that, when one part of your population is unsafe and the military is being unleashed against them, it's only a matter of time until it happens to the entire country. And in fact, a lot of activists for Myanmar and for the Rohingya are saying that when there is political will, and you need just look at the Ukraine situation, and when countries do want to act, they will. And unfortunately, now we can see the hypocrisy of the international community and how that hasn't happened for Myanmar or for the Rohingya.
Yeah, which again, I mean, gets me to highlight and maybe put a cautionary note on a country not too far away from Myanmar, which is India, right, with its own issues, right? And seeing the growing attempts to effectively eliminate other parts of the population only because they're not Hindu, right? What in terms of these attacks? Let me just understand this. You made a point about these rebels coming together. Are these rebels belonging to a specific ethnic group, and what percentage of this group specifically would constitute what you would call the Rohingya Muslims, or is that not the case?
Okay, so Myanmar has 135 ethnic minorities. In 1982, the government removed or revoked the Rohingya citizenship by law, and so they are not seen as an ethnic minority in the state. However, along all the borders, ethnic minorities have been rejecting military rule and fighting the military in some of the longest civil wars in the world. And so all of those armed groups along the Chinese border, the Thai border, they have all basically united in terms of fighting a common enemy since the coup. And what has happened is that young people from major cities have now gone to ethnic areas to have some military training. And that is basically how, one of the segments of the People's Defense Force was formed.
And as far as the Rohingya Muslims are concerned, I mean, so yes, I know you've done extensive work on them. Many of them living in neighboring Bangladesh now. What's the position of them, and what's the status? How many of them living in neighboring Bangladesh? How many still there in Myanmar? What's their position right now?
So still around 600,000 living in Myanmar are still under some of the worst conditions. Since around 2012, 120,000 of the Rohingya population was forced into IDP camps, and they're still living there till today. And this is really so hilarious when you think about the Myanmar government and Bangladesh speaking about repatriation, because where would you send these Rohingya, right? The over 1 million living in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which has now become the largest refugee camp in the world. And around 30,000 children are born annually in Cox's Bazar. So speaking about repatriation to Myanmar, which is again one of the Bangladeshi officials spoke about this week, it's too soon. And when we're speaking about repatriation, we have to speak out a dignified, protected return. And how can that happen under the coup conditions?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I'm just thinking, for the people, and often we talk at a broad, higher level, and we tend to ignore and forget the people. For those people that you referred to living at Cox's Bazar, damned if they get repatriated, because they're in trouble when they get back home, and who knows what will happen there. And on the other hand, damned if they stay at Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, because in fact they are not from Bangladesh; they're citizens of Myanmar. So then, in fact, their rights have been removed, and they've been dispossessed of their own heritage, isn't it?
Exactly. And they've never been given refugee rights. In fact, they can't leave the camps to seek livelihood. And the camps are fenced in, right? And so we've seen that with all the fire situations that have happened, people can't even escape these fires, and they're dependent on a ration. And those rations have been cut by 17%. So it went from something like $12 per head to like $10 per ration. And that is under 200 Rand a month that people are expected to live on. And especially when we think about Ramadan and we think about, iftar, how is it possible that these people are expected to live like this under these conditions? No access to school, no access to livelihoods. It's just a terrible situation.
Well, absolutely, it's just horrific, and it still does continue. Lastly, from your advocacy work around, as it says, protecting the Rohingya, right? How successful have you been, and say your partners and your allies, in providing the type of protection they need, but then very importantly, to be able to resolve these long-standing issues so that they can live this normal life, which clearly is far from normal right now.
I mean, I feel like we've come a long way from 2012 to now, with a lot of people being aware of the situation and of cases currently being on at the ICJ, the ICC in Germany and Argentina against Myanmar, whether it's against officials or against the state. So there's a lot of awareness. There is, people understand the situation. But then on the other hand, with a lot of aid being now diverted to the earthquake in Syria and Turkey, to the Ukraine, the funding towards the Rohingya situation, for example, has really dropped, and we can see that by the World Food Programme ration cuts. And so, of course, a lot has been done, but it's not enough, and we can't sit back and wait for governments to take steps. There's something that every single one of us can do, and I think this is what we need to remember: that activist is not someone out there, who is working on a specific issue. Activist is all of us. And I think that's what's going to change the situation in the end.
And I think that's an important point to punctuate. Activists is all of us and can well be all of us, no matter where you are in the world, as you've just proved. Advocate Shabnam Mayat, appreciate your time. Thanks for enlightening us. And again, both from an internal point and then the broader issue of the Rohingya. You wish, that day will happen, but we don't have to talk about that. But the reality is the issue continues, and where does the light... where we find that light, I don't know. Appreciate your time. Thanks so much for that. Assalamu alaikum.
Very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Well, there you are. What do you have you forgotten about the Rohingya story in the light of talking about so many other issues? And then that's the one thing. And then there are, and I'm talking South African humanitarian organizations in particular, who spend a lot of time with humanitarian aid in South Africa, as they should. Then they're spending a lot of time on the African continent, as they should, and then spending lots of time in the Middle East, as they should, right? How many of them involved in Rohingya? It's simply a question I'm asking. I'm just wondering in the fundraising around Ramadan for the humanitarian aid. Has Rohingya come up, and maybe I've just forgotten about it? So if you know of any organization from South Africa, in particular, not so much doing advocacy work like Shabnam Mayat, but providing humanitarian aid, let's say at Cox's Bazar, for example, in Bangladesh, let me know. I'd love to know. And send us a voice note if you can. 061 766 0355. Let's talk money. Let's talk growth. Let's talk investment, right? With Rizwana Sumar. That's as per yesterday's South Africa Investment Conference, right after this.